This is Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock rejoice in an interesting, subtle, and nuanced Psalm of Ascents, Psalm 129.
That is so true. I have an interesting poetic wording of this psalm from Isaac Watts. And regarding the last few verses, Watts writes in the psalm in English. It's from a Psalter. And let's just hear how Watts poetically puts this last part. Watts says, "The Lord was angry on his throne, and with impartial eye he judged the evils they had done, and let his arrows fly." And then the next verse, "How was their arrogance surprised to hear his thunder roll, and all the foes of Zion cried with horror to the soul. Thus shall the ones that hate the saints be judged by God on high. Their glory fades, their courage faints, and all their schemes shall die." Wow. We have to press this more. I'm certain if I would talk to a non-believer or an atheist, for example, and say, why shouldn't our society be based on what we would call a vigilante form of justice? As believers, we're presenting a reality that the universe is governed and administered by a God in heaven. And Chuck, maybe I steal from you, and maybe I do it in such a way that I'm so clever that you can't even respond back to it. Maybe I'm too fast for you and I take something from you and I run away and get away before you can stop the theft. Or maybe like we talk about in the culture today, how do people feel about in the culture wars about things like justice, things like inequality, things like privilege? And I don't know that we have to necessarily go fully into contemporary issues, except to say the materialist response is there is no governor, there is no administrator, and so why not? Now, I'm not saying that this is that non-believers advocate or justify theft or other moral evils. What I'm saying is they don't have a universe that they can rest in. They don't have a reality where they can just rest and say, you know what? God will make right the theft. Something will happen. The Lord will see, the Lord will shoot his arrows into that person, and I don't even need to do something. And contrast that with the materialist understanding that reality is really only governed by time and chance and random interactions of impersonal forces. And so where are you going to rest if you have a strong sense of justice in that world? What would you say, Chuck, to somebody that you're talking with who wanted to presuppose that, but also wanted to have some sense of justice or fairness? Some people call it karma, but didn't want the God or the personal direction in reality that would allow for that. How would you respond to them?
Yeah, it's interesting because, and it's interesting that you bring up this concept of karma, because I think in recent decades, that concept has become very popular in American and Western culture. Not that perhaps the idea of karma in some ways wasn't already, there's sense a little bit of that. It's a little different in the old eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but even then it wasn't quite the same. And it's interesting that in today's world, people talk all the time, right? Karma's going to get you. Or you got bad karma. That terminology has become much more popular even than it was, say, when we were kids back in the 70s or into the 80s. And it's interesting to me because people who talk about karma, and there's you see it a lot in film and television, you'll see movies that are really, it's all about that, about good people who are getting screwed over. Karma usually comes around and good things happen to them, and the people who oppress them, bad stuff happen to them. But there's never really any discussion of how did that come about and who decides, and at what point is something causing bad karma versus it's something that somebody felt that they had to do. And a lot of times it's a very shallow, and obviously television and films often are rather shallow, not always, but often are, but they don't really get into those deeper questions. Or if they do. And I have seen some films that get a little bit more deeply into the fact that, hey, if you don't have a ruler, a standard, a plumb line that is never moving, that is always, that you can always measure again, how does one know? And if you do have such a measure, such a plumb line, where does it come from? To what is the plumb line hooked? What's the top end of it the weight is hanging from, to make sure that things are straight? And when those questions get dealt with, it's often in a very nihilistic kind of way. It's this person, all they were doing was trying to protect their family, and this person was just trying to protect their village or whatever. And I guess there's really no good answer. And you get movies like, I think it was called The Unforgiven. It was a Western from about maybe 10, 12 years ago. And I think it's reflected that they wanted to get away from the shallow, hey, good things come to those who wait. And if you just hang in there and be good to people, everything will turn out okay in the end. And it deals with the fact that doesn't always turn out that way. And it deals with the fact that if you don't have a solid way of measuring what is good, what is evil, there's really nothing there. And a lot of people thought it was a very dark movie, and in many ways it very much was. But it also, I think, was useful in thinking about, hey, there's got to be a way to measure that. And where I think this connects with our psalm today is, I think we can point out that in the same way that we rely on God for vengeance because we're unable to do it ourselves, we also rely on God, for vindication. This may be the best word to use here. We rely on God for vindication because he is the measure of what is good and what is evil. And so since he is the measure, only he is able to be perfectly just in meting out whatever vindication need to be weighed out in particular circumstances.
Definitely. Now, working back toward the beginning of the psalm, having scoped things out like we have, I want to drop the bottom out. If you or I, Chuck, were reading this psalm for the first time, if we did not have 20 years of biblical training, let's say, and we were just Joe Average, and we just read this psalm apart from the rest of the scripture, maybe just somebody comes up to you on the street and said, here's a piece of literature, here's a poem, read this. There would be, based on how the psalm begins, there could easily be a presumption of victimhood here. So verse 1 opens this way. Israel says, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth. And I think the important thing to remember here is that in the abstract, we should think of Israel as the victim of an oppressor. But with the additional context of the scriptures, we have to ask some questions. First of all, during this time, God himself had committed himself to the government of Israel. So why then, if God is boss, if God is God, and if God is the governor, why then is Israel being oppressed? And so this is where the 10 to 20 years of reading the scriptures, understanding the historical context, have to come in and have to inform us to something subtle going on here. You and I talked before our session about my jail ministry, and I loved talking with men in jail. And it wasn't exclusively men, but my particular assignment was almost always directed towards men in jail. So I have some direct experience talking with them. And what I found is a lot of them were coming from a position similar to the people of Israel in this psalm. Now, I'm not passing moral judgment on anybody, and I'm not making a statement about crime or criminality or the justice system today. But it's not all that controversial to say that as a generality, there's a good chance when you're talking to somebody about their situation in jail, there's a good chance that there's some involvement on their part that's not innocent. Now, we have to consider the same thing here. If God had committed himself to govern the nation of Israel, then why is it that Israel is being oppressed? This is where the study of the scriptures come in. We don't have to guess. We don't have to speculate and make up a reason as to why God would allow his own people that he had committed to govern to be oppressed. We can see all throughout the testimony of the Old Testament scriptures that God had a conditional governance with the people of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 28, I think, is one of the famous chapters. And maybe we'll have to read that one day. But it's basically a chapter of blessings and of cursings. So the first part of Deuteronomy chapter 28, it talks about if you obey, if you follow, if you will work within the framework, the judicial framework, the law, the 10 commandments that I give you, then I will bless you. But if you do not obey, then I will curse you. And so I think it's important to realize as we open up verse 1 and we hear the groaning, we hear the sighing of people of Israel. Oh, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth, let Israel say. Let me actually read how Isaac Watts poetically says it. He says, up from my youth, may Israel say, I have been nursed in tears. My griefs were constant as the day and wearying as the years. Up from my youth, I bore the rage of all the sons of strife. They oft assailed my greater age, but could not end my life. And I want to share with you that one of the hardest things in talking with so many of these men in the jail ministry was to change the picture, change the frame. So they would come to me and come for counseling and come for, now spiritual counseling. I wasn't giving them legal advice, but they would come to me for spiritual counseling and they would come as victims. Oh, poor me, poor me. And I'm not trying to negate that, but what was so easily omitted from the discussion was I would ask, why would events like this happen to you? Why is it that you're in this situation that you're in? And sometimes I would hear some of the standard answers. Oh, the cops are corrupt. The DA is corrupt. The system is corrupt. The neighbor who called the cops on me is corrupt. The folks who took their side are corrupt. Sometimes you heard some of that, but more often than not, the inmate that I would be counseling would say, I played a part in this situation escalating. And we have to, I think, as people, always remember that though Israel is complaining to God about being unjustly oppressed, and social justice is the big thing in the culture wars today, we can't read this psalm without acknowledging that, hey, wait a minute, there is likely a sequence of events behind this situation. There's a context. And I'm not just pointing a bony finger of condemnation, and I'm not just presuming guilt. But what I am saying is when we live our lives and when bad things happen to us and we only see ourselves as victims and we don't see that larger picture, that we ourselves participate to significant degrees in lives that we live and in the events that happen to us. This is not to say that there's never injustice. This is not to say that everybody's at fault for where they are and what's happened to them and what they're facing legally and judicially. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying it's such a part of the human condition to play the victim. And how many situations, there's no situation here where Israel is just the victim. The nation, we see from the testimony, has continually turned its back on God, has continually disagreed with and disobeyed the moral commandments, the civil and ceremonial commandments that God had laid out for the nation. And sure enough, just like clockwork, there were responses, there were consequences. And so the phrase here in verse 3, plowmen have plowed my back and made their furrows long. What's that kind of giving you an image of? Imagine you and I striving with each other, and I knock you over, and then I put my foot on you, and then I plow a field in your back. That's this idea of this has been going on for a long time. And to know that God has mediated this, that none of this has come apart from his sovereign decree, has come apart from the context that he has established, is comforting to the believer, but I think very offensive and scandalous to the non-believer who thought, I am my own autonomous self and I can do as I please. The answer is no. You are not your own boss. God is your superior. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to grapple with, Chuck. What would you say about that context and about this not presuming that the people who are being the victims are not also to some degree culpable or guilty for the situations they find themselves in?
Yeah, there were a couple of examples that I thought of. One that tends more towards the fact that we're at least partially at fault for some of the things that happen to us, and then some that go towards just how do you deal with it when you really are a victim of injustice? Because it's true there are victims in the world, and how do you deal with that? And so the first thing I was thinking about it as you were speaking is I was thinking about how Alcoholics Anonymous and the other AA like group and have made use of the Serenity Prayer, right? And the Serenity Prayer doesn't come from Scripture. It is, to me, in some ways, somewhat in that sort of general revelation idea, although it was a Christian theologian, maybe a somewhat liberal Christian theologian, but still a Christian theologian who first wrote the Serenity Prayer. And it talks about asking God to grant serenity to accept the things I can't change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, they really focus on that by basically saying, look, there's some things you can't change. And it is true that often among alcoholics and others who are addicted, there are things outside of their control. And often there are things that have happened in their life that have had a negative impact on them that were outside of their control. It's always amazing how much family history is often involved in alcoholism, how much abuse and poverty can play a role into those things. And some of those things you can't change, right? You can't change who your parents are. If your parents were abusive parents, or if there is and I think there may be even a genetic predisposition at times towards addiction. And you can't help those. You can't change them. But there are things that you can change. There are always things. And AA tells people to go out and do those things. And it forces the people who are involved in trying to change their lives better to take specific steps. And so you have this 12-step program. Again, not necessarily scriptural principles, but again, I think general revelation has played a role there in giving the people with AA sort of good information about how important it is to take those things that we do have control over and do something about it. And those are often our own shortcomings, our own negative things that we've done. And sure, maybe some of them come from other things in our lives that we can't change, but we're still going to change what we can change. And so there is a sense then that when we say, okay, I'm going to take control, at least of those things that I can control, then you are shedding this negative victimhood and choosing to do something about it. And yet there is always this other side of the Serenity Prayer that says, grant me serenity to accept the things that I cannot change. And so it's not saying go out and forcibly change everything, and if somebody did wrong to you, go out and kill them or whatever. But it's basically saying, yeah, there's some things that can't change. I think if the psalmists were writing it, it would be, God, grant me the serenity to know your justice and to know that you're in control and that you are all knowing and all powerful. And the Serenity Prayer doesn't quite go there. But it would also talk about then in those areas that we have control. The other interesting area I was thinking about, and I think it's something that we sometimes forget about, in the civil rights movement, there certainly was a level at certain times in the civil rights movement where folks were fighting in some ways to get the rights that had been promised, fighting not necessarily in violence. And of course, there is some of that among some people. But when you look at some of the main leaders of the civil rights movement, they often talked about nonviolent change and the types of things that one would do, the sit-ins at the pharmacies, where you'd sit at the dining counters and those kinds of things, and sitting on the bus and those kinds of. But there is also a long history in the African American church of also where one cannot make changes, where oppression is just overly all-encompassing, that there was still a faith that God would still provide at some time. And maybe it wouldn't even be till the end of time. And so you get some of the old Negro spirituals that talk about I'll fly away or swing low, sweet chariot. Now, obviously, the fact that this all goes together, you've got sort of these spirituals that talk about relying on God, and you've also got the civil rights movement where there are things that folks took into their own hands in order to obtain the rights that had been taken away from them. It shows that there's always this balance, but it's not about victimhood, and it's also not about I'm going to take whatever I can take by whatever way I think. But there was always in the Black church an understanding that even in the fight for civil rights in the South in the 60s, there was still always a sense of reliance on God to guide. And I think at that time, a lot of the leaders in the civil rights movement were past reason for that. And I think when I'll watch, in modern days, I'll watch histories of that time, and it's always striking to me how much the church played a role and how much Christian faith played a role. And I think that's also a reminder to us. We still can put faith in God for our vindication. And so recognize that at times we've had plowers plowing furrows in our back, and sometimes that's not through any fault of our own. That's not victimhood. That's just reality. And now we're going to do what we can about it, but we're also going to know that whatever action we take, it has to be based on God being the ultimate standard, and it has to be God's justice and God's vindication, not our own. Otherwise, instead of civil rights movement, we get a revolution. And oftentimes in a revolution, all you're doing is turning things completely upside down, and suddenly you've got different people oppressing people. We saw that with the French Revolution, for example. And that's not vindication. That's just simply reversal. And that's not necessarily what Christians should be looking for.